This is episode 73. You're not sure for some reasons? Well, if you assume, yep, right, did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, so if you assume, yep, right, did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So if you assume, yep, right, did I realize that visually? Of course. Did I realize that? Yep. Right. If I assume visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, so you assume? Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Yep. Right, So if you assume? Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So if you get visually, yep, right. So if I get visually, I know. So if you assume, yep, right. I have no idea. Of course. So you assume, yep, right. You have no idea. I know. If you assume, visually, of course. You have no idea, right? Well, if you assume, yep, right, did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. No way. So if you assume, yep, right, You have no idea, definitely. So if you assume, yep, because I didn't know this, definitely. So if you assume, yep. Right, did I realize eventually? Of course. If I assume, eventually, you have no idea. If I assume, eventually, of course, you have no idea. I know, right? So if you assume, yep, right. Did I realize eventually? Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? So if you assume, yep, right. If I assume usually, of course. You have no idea, right? Well, if you assume, yep, right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea, right? Well, if you assume visually, I know. So if you assume, yep, right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. Did I realize that? Yep, right. If I assume visually, because you didn't know this, if you assume visually, if I assume visually, so if I assume visually, of course you have no idea. I know why. So if you assume, right. Did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. No worry. So you assume? Yep. Right. Did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. No worry. If you assume eventually. Of course. So Eve, you assume? Yep. Right, did I realize eventually? Of course. If you assume eventually. I know, right? If I assume eventually. Of course. So if you assume eventually. Yep. Right. Did I realize that? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So if you assume. Yep. Right, did I realize that? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume Julie? Yep. Right, did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume? Yep. Right, did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume? Yep. Right. Did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, why? So, Eve, you assume? Yep. Right. Did I realize eventually? Of course. You have no idea. If you assume, eventually. Of course. You have no idea. If I assume, right? Of course. You have no idea. I know. If I assume, eventually. I know, right? So, if you assume, yep. Right. There is actually a course. If I assume, usually. I know, right? So, if you assume, yep. Right. Did I realize actually? Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume, yep. Right. Did I realize actually? Of course. You have no idea, eventually. If I assume, definitely. Of course, you have no idea. If I assume, right? Well, if you assume, yep. Right, there is actually, of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume, yep. Right, there is actually, of course. You have no idea. No way. So if you assume, yep. Right. So if you assume, Julie, yep. Right. There is of course. You have no idea. No way. So if you assume, yep. Right. There is actually, of course. So, if you could assume, yep, right, yeah. There was of course. You have no idea. I know, why? So, if you could assume, yep, right, yeah. There was actually, of course. You have no idea. If you could assume, yep, right, yeah. There was actually, of course. You have no idea. If I could assume immediately, I know, why? So, if you could assume, yep. Right, yeah. Did I was obviously? Of course, you have no idea. If I could assume immediately, I know, why? So, you didn't know this? Nope. Right. So, you can assume? Yep. Right. Did I was of course, you have no idea. For some reasons, definitely. If I could assume. Did I realize yep. Right, so you can assume. Yep. Right, yeah. Did I notice that? Nope. You have no idea, right? Well, you can assume. Yep. Right. So you notice? Nope.